Director of Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI for short. And as you can see, and as you know, or else you're in the wrong room, we're here to discuss managing the added burden of climate change in conflict-affected settings. And before I make a couple of remarks, I'll introduce the panelists. And we have 3, which is a nice number to have when we have an hour for the meeting. We're going to do it as a conversation rather than as lectures at the lectern and so on. And I will hope to bring in questions from you all if you have questions during the course of it. And there'll be a roving mic that will be passed around chaotically at some point, if we can manage. So, yes, so my 3 panelists sitting next to me on my left is Mamta Murthy, who's the Vice President of the World Bank for Human Development. And on my right is Sharon Burke, who's the founder and president of Ecospherics, and is known, I think, to many people as the former Assistant Secretary of Defense in the US when she was dealing with many of these and energy-related questions. And at the far end along here is my good friend, Ambassador Ahmed Abdel Latif, who's the director of what I always call CCCPA and leave it there. But it's actually the Cairo International Center for Conflict Resolution, Peacekeeping and Peacebuilding. And if you count very hard, you can't find 3 C's in there, but never mind. Or maybe you can. Well, whatever. Anyway, so look, let's crack on. One of the things is that essentially we know what the problem is, but we don't know what the solutions are. And I want us to be, as much as we possibly can this afternoon, oriented, forward-leaning, thinking about how to resolve the problems. Our research at SIPRI has shown quite clearly links between the impact of climate change and increasing insecurity in a number of different environments. And this impact comes home in terms of increased risk of conflict, increased displacement of people, increased pressure on peace processes, increased pressure on institutions and on representativeness of those institutions, increased pressure on resources, and so on. And I think a few years ago, when some of us started on this, and I've seen a colleague here coming in this evening who I think it must be, Janani, is it 17 years ago we started working on this? And looking back at that point, I think that when we were talking about the relationship between climate change and insecurity, we didn't actually have a whole lot of evidence. We had parallel cases to think about. We had logic and we had intuition. But there wasn't a whole lot of evidence, and there was a lot of criticism about the case that climate change contributed to insecurity, partly because some people overstated that case and said, here's the first climate war in history, and partly because some of the connections did actually indeed seem a little bit obscure. If you looked back over the previous 50 or 60 years, you couldn't see it. But we were looking forward over the next 20 or 30 years and insisting it will come. And unfortunately, we proved to be right. Unfortunately, events have caught up. And now we do know that the impact of climate change contributes to increased risk of all kinds of instability, upheaval, up to and including open armed conflict. Okay, so that's where we are. That's the problem. Let's try not to talk about that problem anymore. Let's try to talk about the challenge of addressing the problem. And how do we bring climate change adaptation into conflict-affected settings? How do we support development and peace building in those conflict-affected settings, taking account also of the added burden of climate change? So, Mamta, over to you, open question. What's the answer?
Thank you so much, Dan. I think I can be heard. It's a great question. And I am going to speak from the perspective of a development institution that provides both resources and technical support and knowledge on some of these issues. Now, without a doubt, and I'm not going to repeat the problem, climate change is causing huge impacts on poverty, on institutions. I really like the fact that you said that, on people's livelihoods, on the movement of people, right? And the way we try to think about this at the World Bank is we don't think there can be any development, which is what we are interested in, without a sustained peace or sustainable peace. And so in the activities that we engage in, we try and bring a lens which supports the resilience of people and the resilience of institutions. Because at the end of the day, and I'm going to speak like an economist, so sometimes I will sound a bit reductionist. At the end of the day, I think being well educated, being healthy, being skilled allows people to be resilient to shocks. And in order to be healthy and skilled and resilient to shocks, it's very important to have the helping hand of institutions that are also themselves a bit resilient. And that's the lens, if you like, we bring to our work. I just want to give one example because we talked earlier, and each of us is not going to talk for long, so that there's scope for a conversation. Let me just give one example that I find very very useful. So let's take the Sahel. Very susceptible to climate change. Climate change is already driving conflict. It's driving insecurity, malnutrition, movement of people. So one of the things that we have supported is a social protection program. It provides very small but important cash benefits to poor people who are able to use it to invest in themselves and invest in their children. These systems can be designed in such a way that you don't have to wait for a drought or a flood or a conflict. You can actually be anticipatory and provide some resources in advance. And this is what builds resilience, and this is what helps deal with a shock which is anticipated ahead of it actually happening. I'd like to come to other examples, but I think this is the kind of thing that we are thinking about, and we're trying to scale to make both people and institutions more resilient to climate shock.
So let me ask, I think what I want to do is to put you a question which has an option in it. You can answer either version of the question. The sort of short, tough version would be, so what do you do that's different in order to address climate change from what the World Bank has long been doing? And the different way around to think about that would be, if we're trying to think about development which includes sustainable peace and a sustainable environment, we're thinking essentially of what people often call the triple bottom line, pay off on each of those fronts. How do you integrate them? At what stage in the process of thinking, planning, implementation are you integrating them?
So I'm going to answer the short, sharper version, which is clearer. What do we do that's different? Well, the first thing that we do that's different is that we think about risk differently. I think when you design a program of support, you have to think about the multiple risks. And climate is some would say it's been an ever-present risk in the Sahel, but we have a lot more information now about what's going on. So bringing in a different assessment of risk is the first thing. The second thing is trying to think about how would you design an institutional mechanism that can be resilient to a shock, right? And often this means working with a different range of actors, civil society organizations, other entities that are more likely to be able to perform, to be present when there's a shock, right? And then the last thing I would say is the actual activities that you support could be different. I'd like to give you an example which is old, which predates the current emphasis on climate change, and this is from Ethiopia. In Ethiopia, the government has a program which the World Bank has supported, and it's called the Productive Safety Net Program. And as a part of this, in addition to providing a cash benefit to a very poor household, there's been an emphasis on planting trees and other kinds of vegetation in drought-prone areas. And the really amazing thing is that when you go back 5 years later and you see these places, well, guess what? The hillsides are covered with vegetation. It's trapping water. And you have these underwater ground springs that are emerging. It's actually quite astonishing when you see it. The other thing that the Productive Safety Net program has done, which is build weather-resistant rural roads. And having a road is actually incredibly important for a range of things, accessing services, going to market. It's also good for things that we may not want to support, but I'll stay away from that. So I think it's design, it's the way you design things, it's the institutional actors that you support and work with, and then it's also the range of activities, which would be different, more different today. As I said, there's some good examples in the past, but this is very different today on average than in the past.
That's really helpful, Mamta. Thank you very much. I want to move on to Ahmed, so you need to pass the mic on to him. So, Ahmed, I know that through CCPA, you've been working very much with the Egyptian COP presidency, and that's where we've had a lot of contact. There's a special initiative which you were really closely involved with in designing to bring climate, peace and security issues more firmly into the climate change COP process, leading up to this year's declaration in Dubai. So, I mean, from that engagement, from your experience, what are the key drivers, the key things which enable and the key things which get in the way of integrating climate action and the peace-building agendas?
Easy question. Thank you.
And for your second question?
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me, and really like to start by commending CIPRI for pioneering work really it has done to bring this issue and the evidence around it internationally, and I think we've all benefited immensely from that work. The barriers, I will highlight 3 or 4. First, we know the issue, as you have said, but yet we continue to work in silos. And the Deputy Prime Minister of Somalia mentioned it today. There continues to be a huge gap between the international architecture of development, of climate, and of peace, at the level of policies, at the level of programs, at the level of funding, at the level of operations, etc. So, and this is very problematic, not only at the international level, because it's then reflected at the national level, right? And it's a real thing. I mean, I mentioned the example of South Sudan. I mean, South Sudan is a country that is half flooded, actually, over the past 2 years. So huge climate impacts. Yet you look at the peace-building strategy that they worked on, and we interacted with them on it. It has very little on climate and environment, because they're the peace-building ministry. They're looking at conflict aspects, etc. Ministry of Climate is not looking at the peace aspect. These are real issues, and they need to be tackled holistically, not through just projects. You know, I know projects are good, projects are important, support at the local level, but we need really tectonic shifts in the way we tackle this issue. And of course, as you know well, Dan, there's no issue that is more salient on this silos issue than the climate finance issue, where we have the countries that are very vulnerable to climate and also affected by conflict, who receive almost nothing in terms of climate finance. And we need to tackle this. I think there's been movement with this in COP28. And then so the initiative we launched at COP27 in Egypt and Sharm el-Sheikh, where we involved in, is called Climate Responses for Sustaining Peace. And it had exactly this purpose, to try to bring out the need for holistic, integrated solutions to break the silos. And it seems to us that the COP space, the climate change regime, because it brings all issues under one roof, agriculture, water, gender, indigenous peoples, you name it, is an adequate platform to bring forward these issues, to try to break the silos, to raise the issue of climate finance. Climate finance is a huge focus on this. Second issue is that we need more national leadership in the countries affected. You know, the work done by multilateral institutions, by the UN, by the World Bank and others is very useful, very important, but it needs to go hand in hand with national awareness, leadership in the design of policies and implementation of policies that again, bridge the gap between these areas. We need to address a capacity gap, actually, the third element I want to mention. Again, we in policy settings, we're all versed into these issues, but you go at the level of many of the local and national officials, for example, in Africa, that we deal, our center does a lot of training and capacity building in these areas. The interconnections are still not clear. All the implications of these issues, water, climate, conflict, dynamics, you put in food security aspects, etc. They're all really cross-sectoral, cross-linked. Again, how do you devise holistic policies for that? We developed a capacity building program called Climate Programming for Sustaining Peace. And it's a program that we rolled out in Africa precisely to bring this, again, holistic approach and build capacities around that with the necessary institutions to take them forward. Addressing capacity gaps is not an end in itself, is to build institutions. And this was also, I'm very happy that this was put a strong emphasis on it this morning, the very key role of institutions in driving these changes forward. So I think these are a couple of the gaps and barriers that I see very important, and that we continue not doing enough, I think, to tackle them. Thank you.
So I want to pick up on the question of silos. And pre-warning, I'm going to ask you about silos too. I think that almost no international conference on development, peace, or climate, well, maybe climate, happens today without somebody saying very wisely, you know, we have to break down the silos. So this is another thing. We know what the problem is. How do we? What do we do that's different in order to get out of the silos?
Okay, easy question. We have policy frameworks. We have in the climate regime NDCs, national adaptation plans. You know, we need to ensure that these policy tools, for example, address aspects related to climate security, to fragility, to conflict. So that is a very concrete manner to do that. Peace building strategies on the other side need to do the same thing. Funding, financing. I mean. Same thing, you know, we have one of the results of the loss Sharm el-Sheikh was to have the loss and damage fund. That's a very important development also to strengthen resilience of communities on this issue. So we need to make sure that this dimension is incorporated to that. And we need to ensure that when we know we want to double adaptation finance. It's adaptation is the key to a bit all of the discussion and to integrate in it these perspectives, and is not, again, happening enough. So these are some examples where we can break the silos and then ensure that these issues are discussed at different bodies, like, for example, COP. The declaration was a step forward, but we need to bring that back to the IFIs and MDBs, and also to move it forward there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ahmed. And I mean, I think I want to add in because I know I ask easy questions, and it's a great position for the moderator to be. But I think that one way to break down silos is to take people places. Right. When UN Security Council members went to visit the Lake Chad region, they came back with a strong statement that henceforth, when looking at peace operations, there needs to be programming that includes the climate impact aspect when that was important and relevant. And they saw that because they saw it with their eyes, and it stopped being abstract. It became real. They talked to people, they listened to people. Sharon, breaking down silos, right. But one of the silos which exists for a lot of people is between security establishment and thinking and the climate issue. And there is a criticism or a worry, a concern out there in the world which has the word securitization hung around it. So how do you break down this silo without touching, you know, sharply those sensitivities around the worries about what happens if the uniformed military or the security establishment take over an issue like climate change?
We can share. It's such a good question, and I want to also relate it back to the point that Ahmed made, which is there's a governing gap. And I think here in the United States, there's a temptation to look to the armed forces to fill that gap because they are the largest of our governing agencies, with a 2 million person workforce, a presence in every state in the country and almost every country in the world, and $1 trillion budget when you count veterans and nuclear weapons and all the things that come under that. It's a lot of money and a lot of people, and a very well articulated bureaucracy. Although we always have to make clear that the lion's share of the US budget goes to social programs, not to the military. But in our governing capacity, it's DoD. So how do you deal with that with an issue like this where there's a gap? And I think it's really important to keep in mind that the military should not be in the lead on this. For all kinds of reasons, including that the things you need to do to get climate security are not what militaries do. The investments in economic development in communities, in innovation for communities, that's not where their specialty is. That's not what they do well. They should not be in the lead. So that's the first thing. I think the civilian agencies have to be in the lead. The second thing is, though, now I'm going to contradict myself. I think at some point, though, certainly in this country, we need to also redefine what security is. And that the threat to, the very real threat to basic human needs, to our communities, to our children, to our ability to live, is something that you can't defeat with the force of arms. So how do we recenter what security means? And does that mean that the military needs to change? Or that who we look to lead on security changes? So I do think in that sense, I don't like the framing that securitization is bad. I think we need to reconsider what security means. And then the last, though, I would also not let the armed forces off the hook, in that they do have a role to play in climate policy, and a very important one. They need to adapt for their own purposes. They have a lot of bases, for example, that are on the littoral or in arid areas. They have to invest in adaptation. They have to anticipate how it might change their missions. So, for example, one mission for the US Armed Forces is humanitarian and disaster relief. And they need to do a better job of anticipating what the demand for those missions is going to be at home here in the United States and around the world, and make that an active planning question. And then also they need to think about the ways in which climate change destabilizes and what that means for them in the future, even if the core response is not theirs. I would like to see the U.S. Agency for International Development be the lead in our government, but they would need to be a stronger institution, full of wonderful people, including people who are here, but they would need to be a stronger institution to take the lead on this. So,
well, since we're passing the microphone back and forth, I have to be really nice to you, or else you just hold on to it forever. But I want to say that I completely agree with what you said, including the bit where you contradicted yourself. I stand on both sides of that as well. So then the next question is in a way the same as the one which I just put to Ahmed, and forewarning to you, Mamta, because I'm going to ask a follow-up to you before we see whether there are questions to come from the audience along these same lines. How do we actually do that? Who needs to talk to whom in what kind of way in order to be enhancing this cooperation?
I think the armed forces themselves do have a very important role to play here, both in terms of they need to rethink how they execute on this role. So, for example, the U.S. Africa Command, they're the major U.S. government actor in Africa is not the armed forces, it's USAID. So they need to think about how to partner there when it comes to climate resilience and other investments. I think also there are things that they do for their own purposes that can be very powerful tools for the rest of government. So, for example, for all armed forces, but certainly the U.S. Armed Forces invest a huge amount in modeling and simulation and in scenario exercises and other kinds of very rigorous planning tools. They should be incorporating, and they are. In the U.S., they're doing a lot to incorporate, just in the last few years, climate change into the way that they look at risk and at future threats. And again, even if the do-out from that, the to-do list is not for them, the fact that they have this very powerful way of looking at future risk is something that can help animate and empower the rest of the government. And then finally, they do invest a great deal in a range of science and technology, and that war. I salute Cypri and the World Bank and Ahmed, all you do on peace building and conflict prevention, but war is part of humanity. It's never a good thing. It consumes and it destroys, but it does have a very strong innovation pull. And can you harness that innovation pull to renewable energy and to materials that are better for the conditions we're going into? And the answer is yes. And the Biden administration has made a number of key investments in electric vehicles and other things where the military is part of that innovation pull and using what they need to be able to do for these terrible circumstances to that question of how do you innovate. So there are things that they can definitely do.
Thank you very much for that. That's a really wide-ranging, fantastic answer. So I'm going to, in a moment, be asking whether there are any online questions and look for the person who is going to have the roving mic to get active. But first, Mamta, I don't want to let you off the hook of if we're saying that one solution to or one answer to the question of how do we manage the added burden of climate change in conflict-affected countries is breaking down silos, then from your perspective in the World Bank and your operations, your planning, your strategizing, how does that work for you? How do you achieve that breaking down of the silos? You can share my mic and Abdul can. Oh, no, okay.
I'm going to say something that contradicts you, Dan. I'm going to say that there isn't enough recognition that silos exist. And let me explain why. If there was recognition, and I believe institutions are rational and people are rational, if people understood that the silo is a big barrier, I think they would make more of an effort to break them down. I feel that often there isn't a recognition that the solution is there isn't a recognition that the solution needs to be wider than what one has proposed. And incidentally, I don't think this is just a problem with the World Bank. I think this is a problem with bilateral agencies. I think this is a problem even in government. And Sharon was just giving an example. So I think there's a lot of awareness raising, socializing, you called it capacity development, that needs to occur to recognize that some solutions are just not going to be sustainable if they are as siloed as they are. And you know, the history of development is replete with examples of doing things in a very technocratic or siloed way, right? So I think there needs to be much greater socialization and recognition of the fact that solutions are not going to be sustainable if they're siloed. Now, assuming that there's that recognition, I think there's a lot that one can do. Within the World Bank, we at the design stage, we have something which is called a bank-wide review, which is that everybody gets to opine on how to solve the issue at hand. So how do we make education service delivery more resilient? This is a big issue the world over. Let's take the case of the floods that happened in Pakistan. Covered 1/3 of the country. All those kids were out of school for a long period of time. And we know that when they go back to school, they're not going to be ready for learning. So what do we do about making sure that kids can learn at home when schools are closed? And the pandemic was the best example of how the world is just not ready for this problem. So this is a big issue. Suppose we say, as the World Bank, we want to help countries address this issue, then we would have what we call a bank-wide review. Everybody gets to opine, the roads people, the electricity people, the digital people, the governance people. And so that helps us propose a solution which is more multidimensioned and cross-sectoral, as we call it. The second challenge is to discuss this with government, because very often you're talking to, as the World Bank, you might be talking to one or at most two ministries. If it's education, you might be talking to Ministry of Finance for the financing and Ministry of Education for the policy. But actually, resilience of service delivery goes way beyond a single ministry. So there's also the business of breaking down silos within government. very often governments do this by having a delivery unit or some unit which is under the head of state or under the prime minister or under the governor of a state or a chief minister of a state. If you're talking about my country, India, you have a unit that sits there, the purpose of which is to pull together from different parts of the government and crowd in civil society and private sector actors. Now, I've seen this done. I've seen this done in nutrition. This is one area which actually you do see improvements over time through concerted government action, which pulls together all the relevant actors. I'd like to see something like this in education. Finally, on resilience of service delivery in education. Finally, I think there's also a role for other agencies, for bilateral agencies, for example. We all have to work in concert. It's not enough for one agency to be taking this approach. I think we all have to work in concert. And actually, I think there's a very important role for the private sector and for civil society and to be demanding this and constantly bringing this issue to the table, because I'm not convinced that there is enough awareness, and when there's awareness, there are the obstacles to implementing, which you've correctly pointed out to. But I do feel that there is still a case for a lot of awareness raising on this issue.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I think that if you looked at universities as well, you would also see that the way in which minds are formed and developed tends to be in channels. And so everything in school and university education which encourages people to be thinking across, if they have, I was brought up in the English system, I had a very heavy arts emphasis at school. So I wasn't thinking about maths or science for the last 2 or 3 years of my school career. And I think that's destructive of ways that people think. So the more you can feed across at an early age, so that you are, in your teens, you're thinking in this way. When you're at university, when you're a clever student and you're succeeding, and even when you're doing your PhD, that you're still being reminded all the time that, remember, what you know about economics or science or education or indeed peace is wonderful, but it's just not enough. Florian, are there questions online?
Yes, there are a few. I think one to kick us off with is given how destabilizing climate-related disasters can be for FCV settings, what would be the panel's recommendations for better leveraging development finance for climate and disaster risk management in these settings? And I think related a question to Mamta directly, really appreciating the point on diversifying the range of actors, including civil society and NGOs. And there seems to be an example where the World Bank issued a special waiver to allow the ICRC directly to access an IDA grant from the crisis response window to respond to the drought in Somalia. Is that one of the ways to make this type of funding mechanisms more common?
Okay, so easy questions from online as well. Leveraging climate finance for disaster readiness and relief, and development financing, sorry, for that. And then the specific one to you, Mamta. Abdul, would you like to kick off?
Well, no, maybe relate to a point that... Sorry, just relating maybe to this question to a point I wanted to make earlier on how we structure the interventions and the funding. And it's something that was mentioned earlier today also in the opening, that in particular climate has a cross-border effect, right, and has cross-border implications. And if you take a region like the Sahel, for example, Lake Chad Basin, etc., you need to structure the funding and the finance on a regional basis, So that is, I think, a way that we need to, or we have not addressed. But how do we really? And I think the bank is doing this a bit already. Started to do this on the Sahel, right? But we needed to do it at a bigger scale in terms of having regional projects that can address the transnational cross-border effects of climate impacts on resilience, on stability, and peace. So I think that is an element I wanted to bring in.
That's great. Maybe Mamta, if you can take on that specific question of whether the ICRC use of the IDA window was, is a precedent?
So World Bank projects can be implemented with a range of actors. I think I should start by saying that there's an excellent partnership with a number of UN agencies on the ground, with which a lot of work is, with whom a lot of work is done. World Food Programme, UNICEF, UNHCR. They're very close partnerships, and I don't think the work that the World Bank is able to finance through governments would be as effective without partnerships with those UN agencies. And indeed, there is the ability to broaden beyond UN agencies and work with other partners. I think every context is so different. So I think the work that has to be done, one really has to think about the context and who is the right actor. And I think this is where actually working with a range of partners and understanding the context more effectively is hugely important, because I think that determines who the right partners are, who the right partners should be. I just want to go back to the issue of using development finance for disaster risk management and for peace building. There's a lot of this that goes on already, both national and regional. So I'd like to say that it's not only about the financing, it's really about making sure that it's effectively able to address some of these sources of fragility, right? And no one's cracked that. I mean, I don't think there's not a silver bullet answer to that, but I think making sure that those resources can be used effectively to address some of these underlying sources of fragility is what needs to be done.
Sharon?
Two things on that. I know that CIPRI and also the World Bank and others have invested in some decision support tools to try to tease out, because again, there's not enough money for all the things we need to invest in. So, what's going to make the most sense? And now we have this ability to process so much data and ask very rich questions, that I think that's very helpful. And then secondarily, the military organizations are never in the lead on disaster response. It's always going to come in partnership with a civilian leader, not at least in the United States. But both the civilian organizations and the military, I think there is a mind shift that they need to engage in, and that's underway, which is they've always focused on response, like disaster response, whereas we're not going to be able to respond to all the disasters. So how can we get more on the front end on the prevention and preparedness and resilience? And again, those organizations have not traditionally done that, but in terms of the legal regime in the United States, there's no reason why they couldn't. So the National Guard and others that are very engaged in disaster response should be looking on the front end and how they can support resilience in the communities that they work in.
So is there a question from you all? So there's... sorry, which one is it you with this? Okay, so there's one question here. Oh, they've been lining up with you. Okay, all right. It needs to be very quickly, because there's several questions, including from down here. So you grab it.
Okay, very quickly. Isabella Toth from the Netherlands, from Cordate. It triggered me, sir, what you said about climate change brings all issues under one roof, and it's an adequate form to tackle various angles, sectoral issues, sectors. I was thinking of the conference convened by AMREF in Africa about a year ago on health system strengthening for Africa. And climate was very high on the agenda. And I have to say that at the coffee corners, people really were struggling with what is now leading, because you had a whole community of health experts who said, okay, now I have to become a climate expert because...
Can I just interrupt you for a second?
So my question is...
No, sorry. I just want to suggest that people do not walk over there in order to in order to line up, because there are several people who want to ask questions, and if everybody goes over there, it's going to be kind of chaotic and there'll be no time for answers.
I am almost done.
So, sorry, I just saw you doing that, and I'm not picking out anybody. I just stay where you are, and the microphone will come to you if we possibly can. So
I'm
quick with the question.
I'm very quick. My question is, what would lead? What would be, what makes that something would lead? I heard sectoral, regional, or actor orientation. That's a question I have. I really struggle with that. And another question that I have, what does de-siloing mean? It's really not that simple just to have, because people don't speak each other's language from their own expertise. So wouldn't it be worthwhile then, Cypri and colleagues, who think more about this, or maybe you already did, what does de-siloing mean in different contexts, on different issues?
Okay,
Thank
you. Take that question there very, very quickly, and then we'll come down to the front, a couple here, and we'll see what the panel can do with it.
Thanks. So from my perspective, I'm a social protection specialist, and I see quite a few links, right? You talked about COP. There was a statement on social protection in climate adaptation and mitigation, loss and damage. CIPRI's been doing a lot of work linking climate vulnerability to people vulnerability to human insecurity, where interventions in social protection could address that. And the FCV midterm review showed that SP&J was the largest portfolio. So clearly, and social protection is classically a nexus instrument, right? Clear humanitarian links, clear development links, potentially clear peace links, though.
Yep.
So the question is, how does that fit in, social protection specifically in this?
Great, thanks very much. Can you bring the microphone down to the front row, the lady here?
Hi, I'm Susanna Cernayevich from World Vision. And just a quick question, is it beyond government or even international organizations when there's so much money in fossil fuels and so many countries that are developing or that are fragile, that want to get out of that state of fragility and see exploring new resources as their way of doing it? So what can the World Bank, what can governments do to help these folks make different decisions?
Yeah. And then bring it along here to the lady here, and then to the one here. So, yeah, they're making mental notes, and they're going to answer what they can.
It's a lot to remember. So I'll also be quick. Leadership in silos, I'll just say, as someone who's worked around, it has to come from leadership that it requires the integration. Otherwise, each unit has their own job. But my question is more, not so much a silver bullet, but how can we invest in sustainable livelihoods that are climate resilient, socially just, all of that, and then additional revenue streams, which I'm hearing more and more of, whether it's carbon credits, green bonds, blue bonds, but helping poor communities, especially those in very vulnerable places like Pakistan. If we invest in sustainable livelihoods, would that kind of hit a lot of the sectors?
And here.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all the panelists for their time. My question is, there was a discussion of solutions to breaking down silos, and one of those solutions proposed was just having more dialogue between different kinds of actors. And what we've seen in the past is that you have that dialogue, but there's no follow-up. So like, for example, the government agencies, I know in the United States, because that's the context I'm most familiar with, they'll meet and we have many different task forces, but there's no follow-up on the specific issues, and what can we do to encourage that follow-up? Thank you.
So that's a fabulous set of questions, and depending upon the answers, we will be moving across to this side of the audience and give you a fair share. I think you've got about a minute each, so you're going to have to be responding selectively and with priority. We have sort of who takes responsibility, what is de-siloing, how do you include social protection in? The question, I think, in some ways of subsidies, the sustainable livelihoods, and the implementation gap, if you like. So, Sharon, you start.
Okay. So I'll take two quick ones. On siloing, of course, siloing is that everybody has a sector or a project or a program, or sometimes by law, a responsibility that they have to discharge. And they're understandably going to be focused on that thing, and there just aren't enough hours in the day to do all those other things, or even to figure out how to work with those other things. So that's siloing, and by the way, in the military, they call it silos of excellence. But I think the way to break them, and you said this, which is, first of all, if this is really important to your government or to your agency, then the leadership has to say that, has to articulate it clearly, has to say, we're going to do this, and then has to say, you, and you you will do this. You have to put key leaders in the right places, hold them accountable. That does not have to be an elaborate accountability metric. That can just be at the next principals committee meeting. The president says, hey, Lloyd, how's it going over there at the Department of Defense on climate security? So, but the principal has to show that they are invested in it. So leadership, accountability, there needs to be a strategy that ties all those pieces together, because people are not bad actors, they're just busy. And then finally, there has to be money. You cannot tell someone climate security is really important for you, you need to work on it, and then give them no money to do it. So if you're serious, there will be investment. And on the resources, I completely agree with you that we are still in a global economy that's using more than 80% of its energy is oil, gas, and coal. And my country has certainly built its entire economy around that. So it's pretty hard to tell Mozambique or someone like that, you should not exploit these resources because you'll kill the world. So it seems to me like it just doubles down on finance and on innovation, that the pressure is on all of these countries that have benefited from 150 years of oil and gas and coal, that we have to find the technologies and the way out and make sure that they are available and affordable for the rest of the world.
Thank you, Sharon. I want to suggest that Sharon may just have said one of the most generous and creative things in this whole discourse. They're not bad, they're just busy. Maybe it's worth thinking through the implications of that a lot. Mamta, your turn.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to address this question of who should lead. I think who should lead on the climate agenda. I think each sector, each agency has got to figure out what does the climate agenda mean for the agency. You gave the specific example of the AMREF conference. Well, actually, at the moment, we have 20 countries here at the World Bank from representing their health ministries. Their health ministries are represented, and each of them is discussing how is the health system going to evolve in their country in response to climate change. What are the disease profiles that they're seeing emerging? What does it mean for the services that they have to provide? What does it mean for training for their medical personnel? So the health system, the health ministry, the health agency has to think about what does climate change mean for me, and similarly throughout so it's really the technical experts, the sectoral expertise that has to be first, and then they have to kind of imbibe a little bit of what does climate change mean for them. And I want to talk about T-shaped profiles, because not everybody in the health ministry needs to become a climate expert, but you do need a few people who have the technical depth in health, but have a little bit of breadth, can do the kind of thing you were talking about. Just think outside and understand what climate means for health, and then they become the leadership in the health sector. So a few people with the T-shaped profile, the depth in their sectoral area, and then the breadth to understand what climate means for their area need to be involved, and that's how you bring climate into a sector. The question on how does social protection fit in, I think you answered the question yourself. I think an adaptive social protection system is a great thing for a country to invest in, and it's really on this hinge between climate adaptation, building resilience, supporting livelihoods, and investing in human capital. So that's why I think the Loss and Damage Fund, when it's created, really needs to think about supporting social protection systems in countries. This allows you to target resources where they're needed in a fast way, and it's accountable, it's transparent, and you can build in those activities that allow people to use the money to build resilience. I'm probably out of my minute.
Over to Ahmed.
Thank you. Already some of the questions have been answered. But I want to go back to the silos, because this is a very issue dear to my heart. Those who are it is the most vulnerable who are the most detrimentally impacted by the silos issues, because they have the less capacities, they have the less resources, etc. We're not equal in terms of how the silos plays out. On the silos, of course, leadership is important. Socialization about the interrelation, interlinkages of issues is important. Maybe if I can add one example and one issue, which is the linkages between the forums discussing these issues. And I'm going to give a concrete example, and I see Andrew Harper from UNHCR sitting there, which is the issue of that is at the heart of this climate security issue, which is the displacement. There's 100 million people be displaced by climate, with huge implications for stability in Africa. That was in Africa. Huge implications for other countries also for stability. With UNHCRs and others, we worked to bring displacement at the heart of peace-building discussions in a forum we have called the Aswan Forum, and then we took it to the COP. Also, Sharm el-Sheikh COP was the first COP to mention climate displacement in its decision. And then what we did with that is to bring it back to the Global Refugees Forum, which happened last December. So countries who made pledges at the Global Refugee Forum in relation to displacement, climate, and peace building. So that is really a concrete example of linkages at the level of the forums, and of course this issue of displacement is very important. I agree on what you said on social protection, very important. It goes to the root causes of conflict. It goes to really to the aspects of resilience should be tackled in the loss and damage fund. And if I could just say, I mean, I think this is a period where there is great insatisfaction with the way things operate at the global level, and there's a great room for creativity among all from civil society, from academia, for many, in terms of how to, make all of these policies and frameworks more work and are better sync and work better. So this is a contribution collectively for all of us to make.
Thanks, Ahmed. And now the last round of questions, and we all need to cooperate in keeping them quick. One here, one there, and one there.
Thank you very much. May I just make a comment? I don't really have a question. Is that fine?
Well, as long as it's quick, I almost don't mind if there's a question mark at the end.
Very quick. So a lot of talk about the silo issue, and that's fine. Let's solve that one, please. But I think there's some other parts too. Staying engaged is another big issue in the fragile context. I just spent the past 5 years working in Sudan. Donor engagement was a huge issue, like, one day yes, one day no. So staying engaged is a huge part that needs to be resolved, because we were doing climate program mixed in with all the other things, and that all had to stop and go just to humanitarians. So thank you very much.
Brilliant point, thank you. To the person behind you, Habib.
Thank you. My name is Habib from G7 Plus Secretariat, a group of conflict-affected countries. A very quick question. I heard very less on the country ownership. I think we are talking about resolving or breaking the silos of excellence. For us, the best tool to do that is to vest the ownership to the countries themselves. Let them identify what their resilience strategy is. Will the bank or the bilateral donors be ready to be flexible to support that, rather than to dictate what needs to happen?
If you can pass the microphone back to the person there with the black shirt. Thank you for the question. Over to you.
Hi, I'm Sophie. I work for the UK government on our conflict research. I also have a slight comment I'd welcome your reflection on. One is, you were talking about climate financing, Ahmed, and speaking as an official who tried to break silos. We were trying to harness some climate financing for a peace program in Nigeria. And it was very difficult because there's no KPI in climate financing for climate security, which I found as a conflict person sort of mind-boggling. Do you agree that that would be positive? Because I had to persuade the Foreign Secretary in the UK that he should invest X million pounds in that programme, but without a KPI, it was very difficult to leverage that funding. So that's just something I'd love your reflection on. And also, Dan, I know you said at the beginning the danger of querying someone of your expertise, that we know the problem, but I don't know if that's really demonstrated at the country level. And I'd be interested in whether you agree with that. The quantitative data that shows how climate and environment and conflict interconnect on a specific territory. When I was working in Nigeria, we certainly didn't have that. Nobody had that data. And so to make the case for major investment and see this intersection was difficult. So I think we do need to invest in that research, and it could be quite costly if you're looking at data. Do you agree with that? And should we be making that case? Thanks.
Great, thank you very much for the question, especially the one inviting me to ask for more research funding. Coming from the person in the research section of the FCDO, I really love you already. We're watching the clock tick round to 5 o'clock, so we just all need to be as conscious as we can of that as we come along the panel. Again, I think starting with Sharon and going along and then coming back, and I'll give you last thoughts, including an answer.
You know, first of all, I think when we talk about silos, to me, what we're really talking about is that our governments are not set up to govern to complexity. And, you know, we are set up to govern one thing at a time. And that if we don't figure out how to govern to complexity, then, you know, we'll be doing one thing and creating a consequence somewhere else. So to me, that's what we're really talking about. When you ask for continuity or engagement, I wish I could say, you know, I agree with you. This democracy that you're in right now, I don't know, right? The current president, if he's reelected, you will see that continuity, and you'll see some great leadership with John Podesta stepping into a key role in the White House. But if Donald Trump is elected, it's going to be 180 degrees different, and that's just the way it's going to be. So there is not going to be continuity, I'm sorry to say. I completely agree with what you said, that we know a lot, but we don't know enough to be what we would call in the military world, and I think everybody uses this term now, actionable. So like if you want a military organization to actually plan and incorporate it into their budgets and equip or whatever, they have to have data that allows them to do that. And I don't think we're there yet. Exactly what you said, how all these things fit together in a way that you can actually use as a planning factor and invest and act against, we're not there. You're going to fix that, right?
Yep, with her money. Mamta?
Thank you. I thought this was a very good second round. I have very little to add. On the continuity point, I fully agree with it. I think it is a challenge, and it's a challenge because we all of us, you know, whether it's government or whether you work for an agency, you have a board, and you need your board to be behind you. So it's problematic. I fully agree with your point about government ownership. I think the challenge sometimes is, and this is where I think having very good analysis and research is important. The problem sometimes is it's not clear who's in charge, right? There's a variety of situations. Who's in charge? Who's speaking for whom? Now, that doesn't mean that as an international community, we substitute ourselves for those who should be in charge or those who have legitimacy. But that is one complication of working in these environments. On the data point, I thought that was a very interesting one. My perception is that it's not that there's a lack of data and research. I just think that there's a cacophony sometimes, and some simple things are just don't get across. And sometimes you can make a very simple point, and if you are able to get that across, it can actually cut through a lot of the confusion about things. I think social media is a big challenge. I mean, there's a lot of social media in some of these contexts, and the impressions that people have about what's going on or not going on is also can be misleading, and that's another factor that one needs to overcome in order to be able to make progress. Thanks.
Thank you so much, and fully agree with Habib on country ownership and national ownership, and I think also Deputy Prime Minister of Somalia said it in his intervention. You know, action and support at the local level and NGOs is great, it's very important, does not replace national and leadership and ownership, which is the bedrock of action. Otherwise, we're really throwing water in the sand that evaporates. So I wanted to highlight, and I think your example of Nigeria and the KPI is a fantastic example of things, you know, the challenges that are faced there. And again, with climate finance and all the institutions are saying, well, you know, conflict-affected countries are very high risk, so it is very problematic for us to deal with them. But I think the mindset around all of that is changing, and we need to continue to push around that. I second Dan the issue of research also, because there is very good research that has been done, etc., but it's the complexity that you mentioned that we are still grappling with, because complexity in terms of the unpredictability of the things. I mean, we saw this summer the heat waves in the Mediterranean, unprecedented. I mean, and the destruction they caused, including in some countries we didn't expect. And then if we look at the interlinkages, again, we are good by issue, water, climate, conflict, food, but then put them all together, water, energy, climate, you know, and then look at the specific local setting and national, that is where it becomes much more complex. So I think granular kind of knowledge still, we still need more of that to inform adequately action. Thank you.
So thank you so much for some really great questions and very good responses. I never turn down the opportunity to say that more research is needed, but I think that the distinction that Mamta made is really quite an important one. There is actually an awful lot of information, and I could, if you like, give you references going back to about 2008, which are looking at the impact of climate change in Nigeria. So I think there is material there that one could be using, but it is not all clear, and it is not all speaking in terms of what is actionable. And especially, it's not always making linkages in the way that one would like it to. We're dealing with a sphere which we tend to call security, which is full of extraordinary interlinkages. Right? We're dealing with another sphere, human society, including the economy, full of a whole set more of interlinkages. And then we're dealing with the natural environment. And I have been hugely moved by a book, is it Peter Wohlleben is the author, The Secret Network of Nature, about these extraordinary connections within nature at both a local and a global level. So we have at least 3 spheres that are characterized by interlinkage and intersection within, and now we're trying to deal with the interlinkages between them. We need to solve that problem, or disasters are just going to keep coming at us. But what you said, Sharon, about governing complexity is a very important part of it. So I think there is still research which is needed, but a lot of that research is pulling together on bits that we already half know, if you prefer. I think a KPI would be great. William Hague declared 14 years ago, almost, that the 2 great challenges for security, one of them was climate change. And so then one should indeed be thinking, if you're trapped in the world of KPIs, you need a KPI for something which is that important. I think a lot of what we've been talking about this afternoon is actually to do with consciousness and the way that we think. Right? We were talking about disaster risk readiness, and there's a cliche from that world. Ask yourself, think about, why does recovery happen after what we call a natural disaster? Why does it happen? Because it must. It's a human instinct. If there are people there, recovery happens. Why does preparation and readiness not happen? There, because it doesn't need to, because there's something else to do, which is also a human instinct. So we really have to be addressing something quite fundamental about ourselves, institutionally, individually, in our politics, in our media, in order to be able to manage the additional burden of climate change. So if I got accused at the beginning of offering easy questions, then at the end I leave you with easy solutions. Can we thank the panel? I want to